Professor Axel Klein, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
Thank you for having me.
Let me start right away with the first question. In your work on East Asian populism, you describe Japan's populist movements as muted compared to their Western counterparts. How does Sanae Takaichi's ascent complicate this framework? Does her blend of nationalism, charisma, and anti-feminism mark a new populist phase in Japanese politics?
I think it depends a bit on your definition of populism. In political science, we have 3-4 dominant concepts of populism. And if you applied these concepts to Mrs. Takaichi, I think you would find it difficult to label her as a populist. There are also a number of less well-known concepts, and maybe here and there she would fulfill some of the criteria. But personally, I find it difficult to call her a populist. And that's because nationalism, anti-feminism, or a distinct ignorance towards any feminist agenda are trademarks of a conservative or a right-wing politician, but they are not necessarily populist phenomena per se.
Right. Prime Minister Takaichi frequently invokes Margaret Thatcher as a role model. To what extent does this Thatcherian populism reflect a fusion of neoliberal economics and patriarchal conservatism unique to Japan's political culture?
If you consider simple messaging, clear-cut language as a populist trait, then that's probably something that Mrs. Takaichi tries. And in that sense, she may appear like Margaret Thatcher. She has referred to her, as you absolutely rightly said. The image of the Iron Lady may be something that Mrs. Takaichi would like to play up to, but she hasn't really had enough time to prove that she can be such a hardliner. The Japanese political system, especially the power structure within the LDP, doesn't necessarily allow for someone to push through a reform agenda. Thatcher did that with a neoliberal reform agenda, and she had Ronald Reagan at her side. So these two were, so to speak, the neoliberal pioneers of that era. And I don't see this context in the case of Takaichi. But what I find interesting, and despite of many commentaries to the contrary, you can read that Japanese culture doesn't really allow for a strong leader. But from my experience and looking at Japanese politics over the last 30 or 40 years, I think there is a large share of the Japanese population that wants a strong leader. And that is because people need someone to take decisive action. Mr. Ishiba, who was, of course, Mrs. Takaichi's predecessor, he tried the opposite way. He was very considerate. He talked to a lot of involved parties and tried to consider a lot of views on a certain topic. But all of this slowed him down and made it difficult for people to see any progress. Mrs. Takaichi seems to try to convey the image of someone who can take decisions and push them through. And that may be exactly the strong leader that a lot of people in Japan are looking for, because they've seen that the more considerate and slower approach may not bring about the results that people want, which is, of course, first of all, lowering consumer prices. And as long as people have this expectation that Mrs. Takaichi is a very decisive leader, I think her support rates will stay high. And as long as they stay high, the LDP will follow her. So I guess the comparison with Mrs. Thatcher may be sustained by the fact that Mrs. Takaichi is a female leader, of course, and that she lacks feminist motivation, and that she had to push aside a lot of male competitors. But for the rest, the tough decision making, we are still waiting for that. But she hasn't had a lot of time yet, so we need to be a bit patient, I think.
Right. How does Prime Minister Takaichi's gender, combined with her rejection of feminist policy, function symbolically within a patriarchal political order? Is her leadership likely to reinforce or subtly reconfigure Japan's gendered hierarchies of power?
I think if you look at Angela Merkel in Germany and Mrs. Thatcher, that you can see, and the same is true for Mrs. Meloni in Italy, gender takes a backseat. The whole issue is not relevant to these leaders. And there are many other characteristics of these leaders which are more important if you try to understand how they function and why they do what they do. And I think with Mrs. Takaichi, it's exactly the same. There may have been some naive expectations among observers that because Mrs. Takaichi is a woman, that's a good enough reason for her to push issues like gender equality, for example. But I'm afraid she may disappoint these expectations. And she may prove that Japan is not so much a patriarchal order, but a very conservative order, dominated by people who have risen through the system and are willing to defend it against progressive ideas. And if you take that view, then you will see that the gender or the sex of the leader isn't really important.
Right. In the comparative perspective you have applied to European and Asian populisms, how might we situate Takaichi's brand of leadership alongside figures such as Giorgia Meloni or Marine Le Pen, female leaders who combine nationalist populism with anti-feminist discourse?
Well, let's leave the question whether Mrs. Takaichi is a populist or not aside for the moment. I think, first of all, she is someone who represents the wish to return to the good old days. And that, again, is indeed something that populists sometimes refer to. And when I say the good old days, I mean the time maybe in the 80s when Japan was economically really doing well, the 70s when it was economically growing, the 60s, of course, when the LDP was still the dominant political force running the country all by itself from 1955 to 1993, so almost 4 decades of LDP rule, and where everything seemed to be more predictable. Stable. And that was before, of course, there was political upheaval in Japan in the sense that other parties took over government, even though just for a very short period of time. But that created some instability, if you like. And then, of course, we had about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we had Prime Minister Koizumi, who came up with a lot of neoliberal ideas, who reformed. That was his key reform project, privatization of the postal services. And if you are now a conservative leader who says we will protect this country and its people from many of these progressive neoliberal ideas, also on a social dimension, because all of these made life more difficult for ordinary people. And what Mrs. Takaichi will probably refer to is more of what Abe Shinzo, former prime minister, referred to as beautiful Japan. He had this book published. He was the author, and he described a Japan that was a Japan of the good old days. And as I said, of course, Mrs. Takaichi also represents the hope of the LDP to return to that dominant position that the party was in 30 years ago.
Right. You have written extensively about the nexus between populist rhetoric and technocratic governance in Japan. How does Prime Minister Takaichi's economic policy, her so-called Sanaenomics, use populist language of protection and prosperity while maintaining elite continuity within the LDP?
Yeah, Mrs. Takaichi claims to revive Japan, which is something that a couple of prime ministers before her have also done. Reviving Japan, that's more or less her slogan. Looking from the outside, and as you can see, I'm not a Japanese voter. I've always been wondering who's been in power over the last 30 years, because the LDP has always claimed to know how to solve the crisis that Japan is in. And most election campaigns over the last decades really looked a bit like there is a huge crisis, only we know how to deal with it. Don't try any experiments, Mr. or Mrs. Voter. Choose the LDP and we will take care of it. But what the LDP has never addressed is the question, well, who's in charge? Who is responsible for this crisis? Isn't the government of the day or the government of the previous years also responsible for what is happening? But the LDP has always portrayed the crisis as something that is coming from the outside, caused by external factors that is beyond the LDP's control. So Mrs. Takaichi speaks to possibly the most important wish of voters, which is stability. And that's a term that comes up a lot in the LDP's election campaigns. If you are looking for one red line through all the LDP governments of the last decades, it will be this term. It will be stability, security, and in a way, the promise of a carefree life. By the way, that's what Mrs. Takaichi also said in her speech in Parliament, that in order to stabilize politics, she has agreed to form a coalition with the Japan Restoration Party or Japan Innovation Party, whatever English translation you want to use, which is interesting because this coalition of the LDP and the Restoration Party doesn't even have a majority. They are one seat short. And they don't have a majority in the lower house and they don't have a majority in the upper house. And if you look at it, you may ask yourself, so where's the stability? But anyway, leaving that aside, Sanaenomics, to me, is like Abenomics. It's a PR term that professional advertisers come up with. It may be wise not to spend too much time discussing this because I think we should judge or assess her performance as prime minister by what she does and not what she talks about. That's, I think, generally universally true. And I'm not an economist, so I don't know if there's some secret recipe to what she's said she wants to do as prime minister. But in preparation for this conversation with you, I have a little quotation here from her speech, and please bear with me. I'll read it, and then you'll see what I'm driving at. Mrs. Takaichi said in Parliament, "We endeavored to raise incomes, transform people's mindsets regarding consumption, and boost tax revenues without raising tax rates as business earnings increase, all in keeping with our approach of responsible and proactive public finances." So it's a bet on economic growth that will pay more taxes or produce more tax revenues. And all of this will also be driven by domestic consumption. If that is a viable option, I wonder why hasn't the LDP done anything like this before? And it's a bit like promising everything to everyone. So again, maybe we shouldn't look at what she has announced and what she has said, but wait for what she will do.
Right. How do you interpret Prime Minister Takaichi's invocation of sovereignty and economic independence from China in the context of populist economic nationalism? Does it resonate domestically as protectionist populism or as pragmatic geopolitics?
I think the relationship with China has always been difficult and on thin ice. It's easily disturbed. Since 1999, when Komeito joined the LDP as coalition partner, Komeito was a stabilizing factor. Komeito has, for several reasons, very close relations with China. And I remember a very tense period between both countries when Prime Minister Abe sent the leader of Komeito to China to mend the relationship. But now Komeito is not part of the coalition anymore. And that weakens options or reduces options to communicate between both countries, maybe even below the surface, which sometimes, of course, is necessary in diplomacy. Now, Mrs. Takaichi has already provoked quite some protest from China. We know about the Chinese diplomat who made this very inappropriate remark about Mrs. Takaichi, and we've seen the usual results in especially the Chinese public, where people cancel flights to Japan. They don't want to go anymore and visit Japan. So with a remark that was meant to emphasize Japan's attitude or position towards Taiwan, all of these consequences came along. And it may be that Mrs. Takaichi still has these hawkish instincts that make it difficult for her to stay online in her foreign policy agenda. And this, if she can't control this, then it would be difficult to get harmonious relations with China going. But again, this isn't only because she has a certain point of view, but of course also because China has or shows very strong reactions to these kind of comments by foreign leaders.
Takaichi's rhetoric fuses anti-feminist appeals with nationalist morality. Does this align with the moral populism you have analyzed in Japan's right-wing discourse, where the moral majority is mobilized against both foreign and liberal domestic elites?
Yeah, that's a very important question, I think. Mrs. Takaichi, as I said before, represents the good old times. So she clearly doesn't stand for a socially progressive agenda, for example. The good old times also had a very weak political left, sometimes none to speak of, and there was what is generally referred to a convoy economy, where everyone in Japan, at least those people who worked in certain industries and certain companies, and their families would all join this national effort to grow the domestic economy. And that, of course, included that women would stay home, take care of the family, of children, and you had the single breadwinner model, where husbands would go out and work. And everyone would profit from this arrangement. That was the general idea. Now, this convoy economy doesn't exist anymore, and it hasn't existed for quite some time. But it's part of this image that people have of the good old time. And foreign influences and liberal forces are seen as impediments to return to these ideas. In the upper house election last July, we've seen a right-wing party grow, a party called Saseto, and I think they translate themselves into English as the do-it-yourself party, which refers to their idea, if there is no political party that you like and you would like to support, then create one yourself. That was their basic idea. And they were created out of the pandemic, with a lot of people sitting at home in front of their computers. And the man who created this party gathered enough support and followers on YouTube and other social media platforms. And then he created, or they created, it wasn't his work alone, but they created Sanseito. But no one really cared about them. They had a group of supporters that was around 1.5 million people strong, which is a lot, of course, but not enough to make any decisive inroads into Japanese politics. And then in the lower house, the general election last year in October, they were not really successful. They had not much more than these 1.5 million supporters. But then in June this year, they started campaigning with their slogan, Japanese First. And they had an agenda that pretty much combined these anti-liberal ideas, the strong skepticism towards anything that is coming from abroad. And because this Japanese First sounded like what Trump and his MAGA people do with America First, the mass media picked up the story. And the mass media, and we've done some research on this here at my university, the mass media really were the ones who made Sanseito better known to people. And then you have this spiral where the party is part of the news coverage in major newspapers and in TV stations, and also foreign journalists would pick up the story. Oh, finally, we also have a right-wing populist party in Japan, the Sanseito, and there is xenophobia. They don't like foreigners. And you could read stories about how tourists misbehave, how people live on social welfare without having Japanese citizenship, etc., etc. And all of this reinforced itself. It's like a spiral, and it got bigger and bigger, and more people learned about the existence of Sanseito. And then at the upper house election last year, the result was that they gained way more seats than without any media coverage. So with a normal amount of media coverage, they could have won. And I think that frightened a lot of people in the LDP. They thought maybe there is now a new force that is overtaking the LDP on the right. So we need to move back to the right to prevent that from happening. And that may have been another reason why not only Mrs. Takaichi was elected president of the LDP, but also why her policy agenda is now moving the country more to the right than it was under Ishiba and previous prime ministers. I don't know if that will suffice to stop Sanseito. Sanseito, in my view, is a very immature party. It has a lot of proposals that very obviously don't work. And from the analysis that I've seen of voter behavior, it seems like a lot of people who usually don't have a lot of interest in politics saw this offer of a new party that said Japanese first, and very superficially liked the idea of a new party that claimed we will take care of the ordinary Japanese. And they may not even have taken it as something that's against foreigners. They may only have said, oh, this is a good idea. It's let's take care of the ordinary Japanese and not of big companies or banks or other groups in the elite, what the LDP has been doing for too long, as they would claim. And that's why they voted Sanseito. But I'm not sure that this success can be sustained. But again, I'm not good at looking into the future, so I'll leave it at that.
Right. How do you assess the relationship between Japan's deep-rooted Confucian patriarchy and the populist rejection of gender equality reforms, such as same-sex marriage or separate surnames?
That is a difficult question for me to answer. If you look at, since I'm in Germany, I very often try to compare what is happening in Japan with what is going on in Germany, and I think to a certain extent, I also look at other European countries. I see how their societies develop, how the legal framework for these communities evolve, and every now and then I thought Japan is following the same path, but in some respects it is doing so later than European countries do. And I don't mean this as negative criticism. I'm just saying that questions like the 2 points you raise here, same-sex marriage and separate surnames, they will probably come. I think Japan at one point will pass the bills that will allow same-sex marriage, and it will change the system of families' names, but it'll take a little longer. And again, I don't know if that's good or bad. I have a personal opinion, of course, but from an academic point of view, all I can state really is it takes longer. I mean, right now you do have the option in Japan, if you get married, to decide which of the two family names, your family, the husband's surname or the wife's surname, which of the two will be kept as the family name. But I can clearly see why that isn't sufficient for people who have their own career, or simply people who want to keep their names. But I think pressure in Japanese society is building to a degree where this is going to happen. And even a prime minister like Mrs. Takaichi, I don't think she will be able to prevent this.
Right. To what extent is her moral populism driven by affective nostalgia and emotional politics of loss centered on family, nation, and purity, rather than coherent ideological reasoning?
Yeah, very much so. As I said before, I think she stands for this desire of many, especially, let's say, from 50 years onwards, the senior citizens, if you like, of Japan. This idea that in the old days, things were better in Japan. And objectively, consumer prices, for example, were much lower than they are right now. And I think we observe this in many countries, that people seem to be overwhelmed by the complexities of contemporary life, and that many people wish to return to how it used to be 30, 40 years ago. Of course, there's a lot of nostalgia involved here, and in fact, life may not have been that easy 40 years ago as some people remember it now. But it is this deep-rooted desire that Mrs. Takaichi is driving on, and that Abe used to push. And it's sort of a promise that you can't really keep. You can't turn back the time. And but I agree. I'd rather try to explain Mrs. Takaichi's policies from that perspective than from any ideological reasoning.
And lastly, Professor Klein, from your long-term perspective on Japan's democratic institutions, do you see Takaichi's populist conservatism as a stabilizing corrective within Japan's party system, or as a potential source of democratic backsliding under the guise of moral renewal?
Let me answer that with a question first. Where does Japan slide back to? You may ask the question, how democratic is a state run by one dominant party for 65 of the last 70 years? We cannot ignore the fact that Japan's democracy, even though it's the oldest democracy in Asia, is in that particular way different from all other industrialized countries you could look at for comparative purposes. So 65 of the last 70 years, the LDP was in power. And most of this time, it was running the country on its own. And if not, it had most of the time one coalition partner. So that's one important point that characterizes Japanese democracy. A second one is that the Japanese voters are overwhelmingly conservative. And this fact is supported by the enormous disinterest of young people in politics. Voter turnout for those under 30 years is a little over 30%, meaning that 2/3 of young people, so 30 and younger, do not vote, which is a remarkably high number. Actually, I consider it to be a disaster for a democracy. You need to get young people involved in politics and interested. I think young people in Japan are not told what it means to be politically active, what it means to vote. And then, of course, when they grow older, they realize that a lot of things that they meet in their daily life, a lot of rules, maybe only taxes, are things that are being decided somewhere, and they are being decided by the government. So you should get involved in politics. I have a lot of Japanese exchange students in my courses here at my university, and it's really frustrating to see how little they care for Japanese politics and how little they know. But so my point, I think, is if you have the young people so disinterested in politics and the senior citizens want stability, then and safety and politics which in a way promise careless lives, then the national politicians can take the viewpoint that maybe we can manage this moral renewal. But I don't think that voters care much about these ideas. I think what they care about at the moment are different problems. It's high consumer prices, like in most countries. The rice price is a very typical, very symbolic problem that everyone faces in Japan. And coming back to what I said at the beginning, when you see or hear what Mrs. Takaichi has said in Parliament about how she wants to tackle this problem, I'm really curious to see if she will be successful with that, because personally, I have some doubts.
Professor Axel Klein, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.